It's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Karen Starr. Dr. Starr is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst. She is faculty at the Suffolk Institute of Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis and scholar in residence at the Training Institute for Mental Health. Dr. Starr teaches, writes, and presents on the intersection of psychoanalysis and Jewish studies, the history of psychoanalysis, and psychotherapy integration. Her books include, and I highly recommend all of these to you, Repair of the Soul, Metaphors of Transformation in Jewish Mysticism and Psychoanalysis. Co-authored with Lou Aaron, A Psychotherapy for the People, Toward a Progressive Psychoanalysis, and an edited book, I believe, Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy Integration. Dr. Starr maintains a private practice in New York City and Great Neck, New York. Will you welcome with me Dr. Starr?
Thank you so much to Stephen and to Brad for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm really honored to be included among these distinguished speakers. What I'm going to be talking about today combines two of my deep interests, Judaism, in particular the Jewish mystical tradition, or Kabbalah, and psychoanalysis. Although on the surface, these two disciplines seem very different, both have in common a concern with personal transformation. Each places great value on the individual's effort to know the self more deeply. I'll be offering a perspective on psychotherapy and psychoanalysis as seen through a Kabbalistic lens. From the standpoint of modern psychology, Kabbalistic formulations can be viewed as an attempt to express psychological concepts that did not yet exist. Yet by embedding the search for the self in the larger context of the individual's relationship to the universal, the Kabbalists gave expression to a spiritual and moral basis for an endeavor that in modern times, in the form of psychoanalysis, has been criticized for its focus on the individual to the exclusion of his relation to the larger whole. The Kabbalistic goal of Tikkun Olam, repair of the world, has been taken on by many Jewish organizations as a challenge to effect social change by adding a spiritual dimension to movements such as the environmental movement and the movement for social and economic justice. I propose that the notion of tikkun, repair, applies as well to the psychotherapeutic endeavor, that the therapist's aim of healing the individual is inexorably linked with the desire to make the world a better place by doing so. In my approach to a spiritually inclusive psychoanalysis, I am not suggesting that psychoanalytic formulations be discarded in favor of spiritual metaphors, nor do I wish to explain away spiritual experience in psychoanalytic terms. Rather, I propose that in playing in the possibilities created by opening a dialogue between them, we can gain a more expansive perspective of this therapeutic undertaking. Hasidic master Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav said, "In working with people to bring them to themselves, one must work at great depth, a depth scarcely imaginable." These are apt words to describe both the Kabbalistic and psychoanalytic endeavors. I'll begin by offering a brief overview of some of the psychoanalytic theorists that have influenced my thinking in this area. I'll give you some historical background on Kabbalah, and then explain in detail some of the Kabbalistic metaphors, tying them in with psychoanalytic concepts. I'll offer brief vignettes drawn from the Torah, Kabbalistic commentary, and my own clinical practice. Many of the ideas I'll be talking about today are elaborated in greater depth in my book, Repair of the Soul. While I have been trained in both cognitive behavioral and psychoanalytic approaches, my preferred orientation is psychoanalytic. Psychoanalysis provides me with an exquisitely rich and nuanced framework with which to consider the myriad of factors that shape human experience. I believe in the power of the unconscious, or that which is outside our awareness, and that it must be taken into account in both attempting to understand and to change human behavior. In particular, I'm drawn to the relational psychoanalytic paradigm as the framework with which to conceptualize experience. The relational umbrella is a wide one. It includes ideas from self-psychology, interpersonal theory, and object relations, all of which presume that human beings develop in a matrix of relationships that shape our experience of ourselves and the world we live in. As psychoanalytic thinking has evolved from a one-person psychology to a two-person psychology, there has been an increasing emphasis on the role of the analytic relationship in facilitating psychic change. The contemporary focus is on creating an environment of interpersonal intimacy from which a deeply personal sense of authenticity may emerge. Rather than viewing the analyst as objective observer, blank slate, or reflecting mirror, the relational paradigm acknowledges that the analytic process affects both participants in the dyad, the analyst as well as the patient. It views the relationship between analyst and analysand as one of asymmetry and mutuality. One aspect of the contemporary relational paradigm that appeals to me is that it has promoted healthy debate within psychoanalysis about theory and technique. I've written about the suitability of relational psychoanalysis for integration with other forms of psychotherapy that are traditionally considered non-analytic. But relevant to our conference theme, relational psychoanalysis, because of its inherent openness to dialogue, is also particularly well suited for a conversation with religion and spirituality. While Freud famously referred to religion as a mass delusion, contemporary psychoanalytic scholarship has been more attuned to humanity's spiritual and aesthetic yearnings. This shift can be traced to Winnicott's ideas about transitional space and transitional experiencing. Winnicott reframed illusion as a way for human beings to relate to reality, rather than as an evasion of reality that must be avoided. For Winnicott, artistic creativity and religious feeling were both manifestations of transitional experiencing, characterized by the growth-enhancing ability to enter into shared illusions, to relate inner and outer reality. He viewed the capacity for illusion as a necessary step toward emotional maturity and relationship with others, and as a potential source of truth, linked with creativity and insight. Winnicott extended the idea of transitional space to include the analytic situation, in which the analytic hour is used as a potential space for entering into collaborative exchange. Following Winnicott, psychoanalyst Immanuel Kant linked the transformative possibilities of religion and psychoanalysis, referring to a longing for surrender of what Winnicott called the false self, for the sake of authenticity. Quote, the discovery of one's identity, one's sense of self, one's sense of wholeness, even one's sense of unity with other living beings. In Kant's view, the sense of unity is an emotional achievement, recognition of what we have in common as human beings. Transformative rather than informational, being rather than knowing, surrender results in a feeling of spontaneity and aliveness, openness to experience, and the enhanced ability to relate to others from a position of authenticity. Hans Lowald considered himself an interpreter of Freudian theory, but his exegesis can be considered a radical one, mystical in its implications, even while cloaked in orthodoxy. Lowald translated Freud's Wo es war, soll ich werden as, where id was, there shall ego come into being, contending that psychic transformation is a matter of the ego's renewal by the dynamic unconscious. Lowald believed that the interplay between the dynamic unconscious and the ego, a reciprocal shaping of different levels of mentation, is what makes human life human. irrational forces have the potential to enrich and transform the rational. Lowald used the term conceer, knowing together, to describe the intersection of unconscious with conscious knowing, explicitly connecting this form of knowing with mysticism. Lowald's vision of a rich human life, and by extension, a successful analytic outcome, is, like Winnicott's, a sense of aliveness and openness to experience without which the human condition would be desolate. Psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion steeped himself in the Eastern mystical traditions. Aware that his views would disturb the psychoanalytic establishment, he questioned the notion that science is limited to objective discovery. Bion insisted that psychoanalysis, mysticism, and scientific discovery all had in common the seeker's at-one-ment with ultimate reality, or absolute truth, the truth of an object that could never be known, but whose presence could be intuited. For Bion, at the heart of the question of what is transformative in psychoanalytic process is the enigma of how the patient moves from insight to change, from intellectual understanding to a newly felt way of being. Bion phrased the problem as how to pass from knowing phenomena to being that which is real. He conceived of the sign O to designate absolute truth and ultimate reality, encompassing both good and evil. From a mathematical vertex, the infinite, and from a religious vertex, the Godhead. For Bion, transformation involves being rather than knowing, and entails being in O, at one with the truth of a psychoanalytic session. In Bion's framework, ridding oneself of memory and desire makes possible the awareness of phenomena that are evolutions of O. Bion offers no rules for interpretation, only rules for the analyst to help him achieve the frame of mind in which he is receptive to O of the analytic experience. For Bion, being receptive to O, which is ultimate reality, requires an act of faith. In the beginning, Freud championed positivism, rationality, and objective discovery as the foundations of psychoanalytic knowledge. Later theorists felt it necessary to find a place for the non-rational in formulations that attempted to explain the mystery of psychic enlargement and renewal. The creation of a space within psychoanalytic theory for an appreciation of the transformative possibilities of aesthetic and creative experiencing, and for intuition as a source of truth, makes the boundary between religion and psychoanalysis a more permeable one, allowing for a potentially fruitful collaborative exchange. Stephen Mitchell, a founder of relational psychoanalysis, highlights the significance of Lowald's theoretical contributions in radically transforming the basic values that guide the psychoanalytic undertaking. Meaning, imagination, and aliveness are now at the heart of the psychoanalytic enterprise. Rather than the triumph of the rational over the irrational, the goal of the analytic project becomes the ability to move fluidly from one realm of experience to the other. Drawing upon Lowald's vision of mind as embedded from the beginning in an interactive field with other minds and further developing from these interactions, Mitchell proposes a system of mutual influence between the individual and the larger relational matrix, in which each, the microcosm and the macrocosm, shape and transform one another. I'll quote here a little bit from Mitchell. In the beginning is the relational matrix in which we discover ourselves. Within that matrix are formed individual psyches with subjectively experienced interior spaces. Those subjective spaces begin as microcosms of the relational field, in which macrocosmic interpersonal relationships are internalized and transformed into a distinctly personal experience and those personal experiences are, in turn, regulated and transformed, generating newly emergent properties, which in turn create new interpersonal forms that alter macrocosmic patterns of interaction. That was a mouthful. I believe that Mitchell is expressing here in psychological terms what the Kabbalists articulated on the spiritual plane, projecting their vision further outward into the cosmos. Namely, that there exists a relationship of reciprocal influence between the microcosm and the macrocosm, between the individual and the larger whole of which she is an inextricable part. Further, as Mitchell suggests, and as the Kabbalists intuited in their development of their theosophical and sephirotic systems, there exist modes of organization that vary according to degrees of articulation of spatial, temporal, and perceptual boundaries. The specific world of reality that we perceive in our everyday lives is the result of an infinitely complex interaction back and forth among these different dimensions of being. Although one may feature more prominently in the foreground of conscious awareness at any given time, they each exist and continue to operate in dialectical and dynamic relationship to one another. In both psychoanalytic and Kabbalistic formulations of transformation, living a life of vitality and meaning requires moving fluidly among these varying domains of experience, cultivating the life-sustaining channels of mutual influence between the primal dense unity of being and the demarcated boundaries of individual existence. Give you a little personal context for this. As a child, although my family was not Orthodox, I attended an Orthodox Jewish day school where I spent half my school day studying Jewish texts and the commentaries on those texts. I became absorbed in the Hebrew language, fascinated by the shape of its letters and the roots and meanings of its words. I was intrigued by the rabbinic method of interpretation, the use of association and wordplay to expand upon the simple, more obvious explanations of the text, and to find deeper meanings. Even then, I was awed by the multiplicity of meanings made possible through interpretation. Later, I experienced the same sense of awe studying literary criticism at Barnard, learning how to take apart a text to expose its many possible truths, to find the meaning that resonated with me, and to own and respect that resonance. I bring this experience and love of language to my own work as a writer, a vocation I've pursued since childhood. Most importantly, I've carried through from childhood the faith in the ability of language to capture experience, and the belief that in the expression of that experience through language, both writer and reader are transformed. This belief carries through to my clinical work, in which I have experienced firsthand the transformational power of the right words at the right time. The question of where is my place in the world is one I've been asking since childhood, and whose answer has fortunately become somewhat clearer as I grow older. Despite the traditional rabbinic warning against studying Kabbalah unless one is over 40, married, and male, I began exploring it in my 20s. I was drawn to the idea of a meaning beyond me and therefore to me. However, I found the Kabbalah to be elusive and incomprehensible. After reaching 40, I took it up again and discovered that I was able to begin to grasp some of its concepts without getting a headache. The writings of the Kabbalah can be frustrating to read from a rational point of view. The texts are often ambiguous, fragmented, and extremely metaphorical. It's easy to lose your way. However, it's precisely this ambiguity that opens them to interpretation and makes possible a renewed relevance to modern life. As they move between clarity and obscurity, they mirror the human psychological experience of insight and perplexity. The characters of the Kabbalah make heavy use of elaborate metaphor. The nature of metaphor, indeed its beauty, is that it hints at truths that are not easily accessible through rational language. Metaphor holds the key to unlocking meaning. The unlocking of meaning is also at the heart and is the art of the psychoanalytic endeavor. The problem of transformation is a compelling one. As clinicians, we often hear from our patients, "I know this intellectually, but I don't feel it. What do I have to do in order to change?" As patients, many of us have likely asked our own analysts this very same question. How do people change? Freud wrote of the arduous task of working through, of the need for the analyst to be patient and to allow the process to take its course. Bion wrote of the need to remain in mystery and doubt, to be open to experience, to being rather than knowing. Contemporary relational psychoanalytic models maintain that it's the relationship between patient and analyst, the collaborative striving for understanding in the context of a relationship of mutual recognition and connection that facilitates change. I believe that all these are true and that they imply a stance of faith. By faith, I do not mean religious faith, faith in an afterlife, or belief in God as a supernatural being directing the course of natural events. Rather, the faith I'm referring to is an inner orientation toward unfolding potential. Faith is our attempt to live our lives against a background of meaning and purpose. In the context of self-transformation, faith is a stance characterized by a willingness, for the sake of discovering one's authentic being, of finding one's emotional truth, to face that truth in all of its aspects, to plunge fully into uncertainty, to be open to what emerges, and so engage in an ongoing creative process of being and becoming. The Hasidim refer to the necessity, when confronted with doubt, of leaping into the abyss and standing in faith. From a psychoanalytic perspective, entering the abyss can be read as feeling what one has been avoiding, accepting responsibility for one's life in its totality, and perhaps the hardest thing of all, giving up the idea that one has to know what will happen next. In the Kabbalistic formulation, this means attaining, at least for a moment, the attribute of chachma, wisdom, in which one lives in the potential of what is and waits for what will come and what will be. The root of the word chachma means wisdom, and an example of a Kabbalistic interpretation of it would be splitting it up into two words, chakeh, ma, which would translate as wait for what will come and what will be. The abyss of which the Hasidim speak is a mode of experience alluded to by both poets and mystics. T.S. Eliot describes it as the still point of the turning world, the Zen masters as the don't know mind, and the Kabbalah as no thing, nothing, ayin, the void from which being emerges. Psychoanalytic formulations speak of remaining in the nothingness which resides between the poles of paradoxical opposites, and of maintaining the tension between the need for discovery and the need for closure. Faith impels us to embody paradox, to leap beyond what is known into the void of the unknown, and at the same time, to experience the stillness of the present moment and to accept its truth. This is by no means an easy task. There is an active animating quality to my characterization of faith. involving not only a receptive attentiveness to what Gent calls the passionate longing to surrender, but also an inflaming commitment and dedication to its realization. Analyst Michael Eigen, quoting the Shema, an ancient Jewish prayer, calls it a way of experiencing which is undertaken with one's whole being, all out, with all one's heart, with all one's soul, and with all one's might. I have taken Rilke's words to a young poet to heart, to be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves like locked rooms and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. My interest in both psychoanalytic process and Jewish mystical thought springs from this love for the questions themselves. This work is the product of my desire to live the answers into being. Kabbalah. Kabbalah is an ancient term coined over 800 years ago to describe the Jewish mystical tradition. Passed down orally from teacher to student, the knowledge contained within Kabbalah was originally kept hidden from all but a very select few individuals deemed worthy of receiving it. The word Kabbalah, which is the correct pronunciation, I usually have an Ashkenazi accent, but the correct accent would be Sephardic, which would be Kabbalah. Itself means received and or tradition, reflecting the care that was taken to keep it secret and rooted in halakha, Jewish law and religious practice. The original flowering of Kabbalah began during the Middle Ages, a period of fear and uncertainty for medieval Jewry. Faced with threats against their minority religion from Christian and Muslim authorities, the Jews were forced to constantly defend their traditions, which were also being challenged by new intellectual ideas such as Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism. They met these challenges by reinterpreting traditional Jewish teachings to incorporate these new ways of thinking. The form this reinterpretation took was the commentary, a legacy of the Talmudic age. The Talmud, or body of Jewish law, is itself a commentary on the Torah. The Kabbalah is essentially creative commentary, a mystical reinterpretation of biblical and rabbinic literature, and rooted in traditional Judaism. It addresses the big questions. How and why was the world created? How does the universe work? What is evil and why does it exist? To name just a few. And I am not going to get to all these questions. The Kabbalists viewed language as the medium through which the world was created, considering the letters of the Hebrew alphabet to be the building blocks of the universe. To them, language was a reflection of the fundamental spiritual nature of the world, a window into the soul of the human and the divine. The Kabbalists raised the interpretive process to new heights of creativity, believing that they could derive unifying cosmic structures from the words of the Torah. In fact, the Torah itself was believed to be the divine in word, a linguistic manifestation of God. The Torah was conceived as a living organism, containing within it an infinity of meanings. So I want to point out that the Torah itself is written only with the letters, which effectively are only consonants. It does not have any of the markings of the vowels, and there's no punctuation at all. So literally, you could take a phrase from the Torah and interpret it, the same sentence, in multiple ways. And there is no such thing as a canonical interpretation. All interpretations are valid. It's said that the reader brings themselves to the Torah texts, and the interpretation is a combination of what that reader brings of himself or herself and the text. Most strikingly, the Kabbalists vividly articulated the radical view of a mutual relationship between the human being and God as partners in creative process. By introducing the notion of Tikkun Olam, repair of the world, which emphasizes the unique contribution of the individual to the larger whole, they infused meaning and purpose into acts of traditional Jewish practice, which had become dry and overly intellectualized. The Kabbalists developed a psychological system based on the idea that the microcosm mirrors the macrocosm. They interpreted the biblical statement that God made the human being in God's image to mean that the creative and transformational processes of the cosmos are reflected in and are affected by those of the human psyche. In other words, the Kabbalists sought to know God through knowing themselves, which sounds a lot like what you were talking about, Shmila. They believed that God is found not in heaven, but by looking inward into the soul. Even more controversially, the Kabbalists believe that through the individual's effort to know the self more deeply and to be transformed, God himself or herself is transformed. The Kabbalists also conceived of God as having not only masculine but feminine qualities. And this feature is a very large feature in the Kabbalah, are the feminine aspects of God. So I'm going to lay out the Kabbalah's metaphor of creation, which is the basis for the concept of Tikkun Olam, or repair of the world. But as I give it to you, don't try to think too much about it. Instead, just sort of let it wash over you. So just try to use your imagination and picture it visually. In the 16th century, Rabbi Isaac Luria proposed that the infinite God commenced the process of creation through an act of contraction, forming a void pregnant with possibility. Into this space, God revealed himself through the emanation of the 10 sfirot, or divine attributes, dynamic potentials that permeate all planes of existence, including the human psyche. These attributes are referred to as vessels, containers for the divine light. Not strong enough to contain it, the vessels shattered, their shards falling and entrapping sparks of light. Some of the light returned to its source, beginning the process of Tikkun Olam, repair of the world, which continues through the restoration of the remaining light trapped in the shards to its source. Strikingly, Tikkun, repair, is accomplished through human acts informed by intentionality, whereby the shattered fragments are reorganized into wholeness. Thus, both God and humanity are equal partners in an ongoing creative process. The Zohar, the central text of the Kabbalah, describes a spark of impenetrable darkness. In Aramaic, the phrase is botzina dekardenuta, flashing within the infinite. Historian Gershom Scholem calls this the crisis that turns God from repose to creation. But what spurred this crisis? Quite remarkably, the Zohar characterizes God's motivation for creation as his longing for recognition by and connection with humanity, the desire to enter into relationship with his own creation. In turn, the individual seeks out God in relationship through his efforts to perceive the divine spark clothed within his own soul. This interplay of mutual recognition is said to sustain the world, whose existence relies on the reciprocal flow of influence between the human and the divine. psychoanalyst Manny Gent proposed the existence in the human being of a force toward growth, linking it to the longing to be known, to be recognized by an other. The Zohar explicitly identifies this force as the primordial creative energy that animates all being and locates its source in God's burning desire to be known by an other. This crisis or turning point of God's transformation is conceived as passage through no-thing. No-thingness, nothingness, is a liminal moment, a stage of reality that lies between the unknowable and the perceivable. It is identified by the Kabbalah as the point of faith. Thus, the startling conclusion is that God's creation of the world, bringing it into being from the state of no thing, is in essence a divine leap of faith. Applying this formulation to the workings of the human psyche, the Kabbalah characterizes faith as a moment on the threshold, a moment of pure receptivity where potential becomes manifest, in a flash of intuition that is wordless but that seeks articulation. Faith emerges in consciousness as a sense of truth that is beyond reason. At the threshold of perception, we cannot yet define it or explain why we feel it's true. Transformation. Although the Kabbalah and psychoanalysis originate from very different perspectives, each is predicated on the belief in the human capacity for transformation in the context of relationship. For Freud, who drew his analogies from the natural sciences, change was quantitative, a matter of degree. The goal of analysis was to overcome the irrational forces of the unconscious, to strengthen the ego, to better equip the individual to cope with reality. Yet long before Freud, the term transformation has been associated with religious experience, with a connotation more qualitative than quantitative. Individuals are said to be transformed by the encounter with the divine, emerging with a sense of reality greater than themselves, a more expansive perspective of life's possibilities, and a sharper perception of their own unique purpose. In the Torah, such a transformation is often marked by a change in name. At the moment of entering into relationship with God through his covenant, Abram, or Avram, becomes Abraham, or Avraham, and his wife Sarai becomes Sarah, signifying that the elderly childless couples will be patriarchs of a great nation. The night before he is to meet with his estranged and presumably hostile brother Esau, Jacob wrestles with the mysterious figure until dawn. From the story, it's never clear whether it's a man, angel, God, or an aspect of Jacob himself. The text is ambiguous, and so is open to interpretation. Jacob's conflict does not leave him unscathed, but it does leave him richer for the experience. Jacob emerges from his encounter with a wound in his thigh and a lifelong limp, but also with an expanded perception of himself and his relationship with his brother. He is given the name Israel, Yisrael, which means wrestles with God, to mark the struggle as well as the suffering that is the turning point of his transformation. Jacob's new name also signifies the manner in which he has changed. When we are first introduced to Jacob, he's characterized as a simple man, a tent dweller, a man who at the moment of his birth grabbed onto the heel of his twin brother, Esau, and then in later years stole his brother's birthright through deceiving their elderly blind father. His name, Yaakov in Hebrew, has as its root the word heel, or akev. The Zohar interprets its meaning as deceiver. Because of his treachery, Jacob lived in fear of being killed by Esav, who was much stronger and more aggressive than he. But on this day, Jacob set out to meet his brother face to face, not knowing what the outcome would be, whether he would live or die. The name Israel signifies an added dimension to Jacob's identity, encompassing a newfound willingness to come to terms with his prior actions, to grapple with their consequences, and to tolerate the unknown of a new way of relating. He's different, somehow larger than he was before. Interestingly, it's the agent of Jacob's transformation, the mysterious figure who struggles with him, who gives Jacob the name Israel. By naming him, he helps Jacob grasp the emotional essence of what he has just gone through and to understand that he has been changed by it. In turn, Jacob puts words to his ineffable experience by giving the scene of his transformation a name. He calls the place Peniel, I have seen God face to face. By naming it, he acknowledges the revelatory nature of his experience and seeks its affirmation through linking his changed inner reality to the concrete outer reality of place. In psychoanalytic terms, naming is Jacob's way of processing an experience that was most certainly traumatic, painful, but also numinous. Putting his experience into words helps him not only to understand it, but also to assign it a transformative meaning, enabling him to go forth a changed person. Through his struggle, Jacob has come face to face with God, and in the process, face to face with the heretofore unexpressed aspect of himself. Or perhaps it's the reverse. Through Jacob's knowing himself more deeply, God is revealed. Maimonides describes transformation through Teshuva, or repentance. The literal translations of the word Teshuva are return, turning toward, and response. Maimonides writes, the penitent should change his name as if to say, I am another. I am not the same person who did these things. The Talmud discusses transformation in connection with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the day that marks the anniversary of the creation of the world, and that begins a 10-day period of introspection and self-examination, culminating in Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, or at one mint. Here, transformation is intimately connected with creation, with the human desire to recreate the self anew, and to thereby participate in the cosmic creative process. The 10-day period of Teshuva creates a space in time for transitioning from the old year to the new, for the shedding of old patterns of behavior, for new possibilities of relating. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz notes that some Kabbalists held that Teshuva was created even before the world itself and is a primordial, universal phenomenon embedded in its structure. The implication of this idea is that human beings were created with the potential to change the direction of their lives. Even in the dimension of time, which flows inexorably and in which the past is fixed, people still have a measure of control over their own existence. The possibility of changing the significance of the past in the context of the present and future. One will note the resonance with psychoanalytic ideas. Teshuva is thus the highest expression of the human capacity to choose freely, embodying the ability to transcend the chain of causality. It is no less than a manifestation of the divine in the human. Lech Lecha, God commands Abraham in Genesis, which is simply translated as go forth. In its plain meaning, Abraham's journey is the classic prototype of transformation through change of place. But the Zohar interprets Lech Lecha hyper-literally as an imperative for personal transformation. Go to yourself, to know yourself, to refine yourself. The Zohar reads God's directive as a call for Abraham to leave all that is familiar to him and to begin a process of self-examination that will lead him to a new paradigm of being. Commentary on this passage explains, every person must search and discover the root of his soul so he can fulfill it and restore it to its source, its essence. The more one fulfills himself, the closer he approaches his authentic self. We learn from this that transformation is a matter not only of leaving the familiar for the new, but also of return or turning toward. In the Kabbalistic model, the desire for transformation is equated with the soul's yearning to return to its source in God. But unlike mystical traditions such as Buddhism, transformation is not a matter of the soul's negation. Rather, it is the soul's fulfillment via authentic experience of self. The Kabbalah views transformation as a two-party process, a responsive interplay between the human being and God. Says the Zohar, once one has aroused arousal, then arousal above is aroused. I'll explain what that means. What this means is that the directive to Abraham, normally we think like God said to Abraham, go forth. He gave him a command. But in the Kabbalistic interpretation, that's not how it was. According to Kabbalistic interpretation, God was responding to Abraham's own internal awakening. It was God's command is given in response to Abraham's desire for self-enlargement and self-realization. In fact, God has been waiting for this moment. The Kabbalah speaks of the divine spark clothed within a person's soul, veiled from conscious awareness, yet longing to be perceived and inflamed. In psychological terms, the divine spark may be read as the intimation of authenticity that is nurtured within the intimacy of the psychoanalytic relationship. Winnicott calls it a vital spark, an urge toward life and growth. Much has been written about the psychoanalytic understanding of authenticity. People have spoken here about the idea of multiple selves, multiple self-states, of standing in the spaces of our multiple selves. The question is the true self a core self? Is the self socially constructed? However, the Kabbalah does not limit authenticity to the genuineness of a person in a given interaction, nor does it suggest a static core self. Rather, it formulates authenticity as the unique creative potential of a particular individual and no other, expressed across time and space. As potential, it can be manifest only when brought down to the level of reality, lived out through a person's actions and relationships in daily life. The divine spark is a singular manifestation of God capable of being articulated only by the human being in the material world. Hence, the living out of one's authenticity in a life of meaning and purpose has not only personal but cosmic reverberations. It is an aspect of God that can find expression exclusively in the life of that person and no other. The Kabbalah characterizes the journey towards self-understanding as Tikkun, repair, by which the particular spark unique to one's soul is inflamed and restored to its source, transforming God himself in the process. This is the individual's specific and indispensable contribution to creation, conceived as the movement toward God in relationship. Reciprocally, through being sought out and recognized by the human being, God's aspects are brought into balance. At one-ment with the truth of one's soul is not a static achievement, but an ephemeral moment that may occur throughout a lifetime, resulting in ever-deepening levels of awareness. It is conceived as encounter with God in the sphere of faith. According to Jewish mystical tradition, the honest examination of the truth, did it go off? No. The truth about oneself in the context of relationship is the leap of faith, the movement toward God. It is what compels Adam, after he has eaten from the tree of knowledge and attempted to hide himself from God, to respond to God's question, "Where are you?" by giving an honest account of his existential position. "I was afraid, and I hid myself." In psychoanalysis, we too continually ask our patients, "Where are you?" encouraging them to reveal themselves, to expose their most intimate fears and feelings of shame when they admit, "I was afraid and I was hiding." The analytic relationship of seeking out and finding, of being sought out and found, nurtures the emergence in the patient of a sense of identity and purpose. As she makes herself known and feels herself seen, she gradually formulates a meaningful answer to the question of where she is in the world. Psychoanalysis has long grappled with the notion of the true self and how it may be nurtured within the psychoanalytic relationship. For Winnicott, the true self is visible in the infant's spontaneous gesture and unfolds in relationship with its mother. Greenberg writes that it is developed within the context of a deep and profound love. The mother, who is empathically attuned to her child and at the same time aware of a future that the child cannot yet imagine, is capable of love that depends upon awareness and appreciation in the moment of actuality and potential, of the tension between the two, and of the possibilities for some resolution. In the Kabbalistic metaphor, the relationship within which one's truth is sought out and developed is between the individual and God, and so on the surface doesn't transfer easily into an application of psychoanalytic technique. However, by bringing God into the equation, the Kabbalists were free in a way that psychoanalysts haven't been to articulate a dimension of psychic change that might best be described in terms of transcendent experience. The Kabbalah teaches us something new. Instead of defining authenticity in terms of an essential true self or viewing it as a social construction, the Kabbalah depicts it as a flicker of unique creative potential within each of us that resonates with and is essential to the larger creative energy that animates the world. In so doing, it emphasizes the singular value of a human life, the unique contribution of the individual to the larger whole, as expressed through the creative process of self-exploration. Further, it instructs us as to the ineffability of the human being, to our inability to know all that is to be known about another person, even about ourselves. Although we may reflect multiple facets, the truth of who we are is not contained in any one of them, but transcends them in a unity that remains beyond sensual perception. The uniqueness of the individual is elusive, requiring something other than intellect to discern it. Strikingly, the Kabbalah insists that the sacred is to be found not in heaven, but on earth. The Zohar is populated with wandering characters who come upon delights of concealed meaning in the course of their travels. In the Kabbalah, as might be said about psychoanalysis, the secret lies not at the end of the journey, but rather in how one negotiates what is met on the way. En route, the traveler unexpectedly discovers the sacred within the ordinary, the meaningful within the mundane, the divine within the human. This theme lies at the heart of the Kabbalistic view of transformation and indeed of life itself. If the Kabbalist can be said to have a goal, it is to cultivate a refined perception capable of recognizing the sacred within the commonplace, and reciprocally of infusing everyday acts with meaning, thereby elevating them to the level of the sacred. In formulating transformation in terms of the individual's relationship with God, the Kabbalah offers us a more expansive perspective from which to view the therapeutic undertaking. It suggests that the relationship of patient and therapist is deeply embedded in and facilitates the larger relational matrix between the universal and the individual. It implies a sacred significance to the therapeutic endeavor, suggesting that when we encounter ourselves in the heart of an empathic other, we at the same time approach God in relationship. In the meeting of minds of the therapeutic dyad, we open to the larger possibility of a mutual encounter with God. In this potential space, which the Kabbalah characterizes as faith, we ask God the same question he asks of us: where are you? Then listen closely for the answer that whispers within us. We discover that we are held in the embrace of the ineffable and unknowable God, who has been longing from the beginning for this meeting to take place. We emerge transformed, having attained, paradoxically, a sense of union with the larger whole, as well as a heightened subjectivity, an expanded awareness of our individual identity that we may then purposefully and with renewed energy carry with us into our everyday lives.